Camille, thank you so much for having us in your studio today. It's wonderful. Where are you right now?
I'm in France. I'm staying at my mom. It's 1 hour and a half from Paris, so it's really in the middle of the forest.
And you are normally living in New York. What brought you back? What brought you back to Paris?
Yeah, I normally live and work in New York, but my passport was expiring. I was on an emergency passport since last October already, and my visa was expiring as well. So as the consulate was closed in New York, it was kind of like necessary for me to come back to France to redo my paper.
Yeah, it's kind of not to be underestimated how many lives have been upended by visa, by passport, by travel restrictions. And I couldn't even believe when you first said, oh, we do the studio visit from Paris. I thought, why are you in Paris? I didn't even comprehend, of course, your visa situation and that the French embassy is closed. So tell us a little bit about where you are right now in the physical setting, because we are visiting you in the studio. So where are we?
So I'm actually not really in the studio. I'm staying. I'm in a studio that I set up in my grandmother's room in a house that is kind of like a century ago was built, and it looked a little bit like a dollhouse. And it's a place called Les Préaux, and it's in the top of a hill in the middle of the wood, and surrounded by one part of the wood, and the other part is the fruit tree that my family, that a part of the family has inherited the fruit tree and is making cherry, and all part of the family is has the wood. So we just had the wood with wild pigs and the little house in the middle of it.
And how do you feel in these unprecedented times? Is this a time for you where you want to pause and reflect, or is it a time where you can actually work?
It's really alternating, I want to say, because at first, when the situation started, I was internally rejoicing because I always like to cancel plans, and I always like to be alone, and I kind of like, I'm always excited about a new trip or a new commitment, but when comes the times to go out of the house, I always like, if I can find an excuse not to go, I'll definitely do it. So I was kind of like really happy that I could cancel all the trips, and I was starting to paint also, so it was really like lucky in a way, because I had all my materials and equipment, and then I couldn't measure it's a bit like an avalanche, you know, like you don't see right away all the implication of the situation, and it's only like a few weeks later that I understood that I would not be able to renew my paper, and that I would have to go back to France and leave all the 100 frame and like all the paint and everything that I had prepared to paint, I had to leave behind. But it also feels interesting. I think that in a way, a lot of like situation that is unprepared, like unpredictable, is also bringing the opportunity to meditate on the fact that everything is never happening the way we want. So maybe that's already a good lesson. And then also I remember that when I did Gross Fatigue, I was actually also in transit. I was just arrived in New York, and all my stuff was blocked in the custom because I had, I think maybe things that were considered maybe forbidden to import. I don't know. But it got blocked for a good 8 months. So that was the duration I was in New York without my books, without my furniture, without my clothes. I mean, really the minimum. And so I was working with the screen, and this situation also inspired the film. And now I'm working a bit everywhere, like in my grandmother's room, I'm working outside in the garden, or I'm working in the living room, and the drawing are drawings in between books and above the laundry that is also drying. And in a way, there is the sort of situation where the domestic life is completely intricated with the professional activity.
Yeah.
Is also really interesting in a way. And I hope that it will also help us reconsider the importance of domestic life, you know, because it has long been considered something anecdotal, unimportant, under a patriarchal vision. And now all of a sudden we all live at home, and we all are discovering that time is shrinked between the laundry and cooking and like caring for the kids or for older people. And I feel like there's also something really interesting to meditate about that.
Yeah, and you had to travel in the midst of lockdown and crisis. You had to travel, because when I first looked at the schedule, you said, oh, we can do a studio visit from New York, or after this from Paris. I thought, well, there's a lockdown. She can't get from New York to Paris. You had to travel with a small child. And perhaps we talk about this a little bit at the ending of the talk, because there are beautiful watercolors that also I think are inspired, of course, by you being a young mother. Shall we go into the slide projection that we have prepared? To this. And Camille, this is, and I ask this to all artists that I do a studio visit with. I ask them where they are, and you say at your mother's house. And I said, what is the earliest work you can remember? And you gave me something from when you were around 27, 28 years old. You had already studied film. And I said, no, isn't there anything really, really early? And you were at your mother's house. And if we go one slide back, you couldn't really write. I asked you, you were 7 years old, you couldn't really write. And you were already making these encyclopedic books. Could you tell us something about this?
Yes, it's. I think that I found many of them actually, and it's interesting because it's a bit random, the order. In a way, it kind of like, now I see it with adult eyes, and I think about, you know, this moment in Frankenstein when the monster is in the cabin, and then he said that he learned everything about the Greek and the Roman, and then he learned how to make bread, and he learned about poetry and physics. And I feel like maybe as a child, I was very eager to compile all the information, or maybe to digest it, I don't know. But I had this, I really liked having subscription magazine. But for a weird reason, the magazine itself wasn't satisfying. So I needed to make my own magazine out of the magazine. So I would select the images that were interesting to me and rearrange them. Mostly, it kind of makes sense. It's by kind of like animal groups. So like this is like all the, I don't know, rodent. And then this is all the feline. And the first page we saw was all the small birds. And there was even a category which is like weird and strange animals. And then sometimes there is a focus on one animal that I like more. And so there's like several pages. So the fox is an example. There is the fox, and there is the fox and his family, and what the fox eat. There is like 3-4 pages about the fox, and I didn't find the illustration, so I made it.
I think it's so intriguing, Camille. If you put these pages into a vitrine in an exhibition of yours today, people would think it's a conceptual variation of what you do. I can't believe that you at age 7 in 1985 did works like this. So and if everybody might just in the slide projection see that some of these photos have actually your hands on it. because you went in the middle of the night to your mother's archive and you found these children's books and you were making a video of you going through the pages. So I'm really grateful that you're showing this to us. But let's go further. We go fast through a couple of these and we go to the next. This is at a time where you had studied film animation in Paris. And perhaps we go to the next. This has a very interesting title, Dying Living Woman from 2005. So that's 20 years later than the first books we saw. We go to the next. Want to say a bit about these, Camille?
Yes, it was right when I finished the art school. I was really interested by experimental cinema. I graduated in animation film, and as you know, animation film is very close to experimental cinema. A lot of experimental filmmakers were also doing animation and vice versa. So especially I was very inspired by a book by Dominique Noguez, where he said that he talks about the books that are made on the table of the kitchen. I remember the expression, and it really struck me the idea that you can do a film like a Hollywood film at home. This idea, and also this idea that you can do a film not as a director with the kind of hierarchical power that the traditional position of the director imply, but in a way it's a fan fiction. You know, it's a film of a viewer. And so that was my first exhibition. It was called Room Movie, and I used the footage of 3 films that I found footage that were chosen because they were a genre film. They were a film that has a very specific genre and were meant to satisfy a very specific instinct. So one is a pornographic movie. It's an amateur pornographic movie. I don't know the title because when I bought, it was just titled Film X. And it was burnt by the light, which is something I found really interesting. It's very red. The second film was The Night of the Living Dead from Romero. And this is the slide we saw before where the main character, which is called Barbara, has been scratched. Like she literally escaped the film by not being physically present anymore. Yeah. And the third film is called Scop, and it's kind of a Franco-Italian production of Alibaba, and but not exactly. I think it's kind of an interpretation of the story of Alibaba. It's kind of a weird film made to be a sort of like adventure from the 70s, and it's filmed in Scop. And as you know, maybe the film stills of a Scop film are actually anamorphosed and compressed vertically. So the film is a trailer, and it's getting narrower and narrower and narrower. So you see less and less and less. Is the opposite of the idea of CinemaScope, which is supposed to offer more. The creation of the CinemaScope had the slogan "Sugar for the eyes."
Yeah, to be horizontal, and really you're indulging in this oceanic feeling. Here there are 2 slides of a work called Minimum of Life. Perhaps we go to the next one. It's a little closer. What was this work, Camille?
So this is very quickly after the first 3 work. I was still interested to work directly on film, but this one is just a sort of animation. It's kind of amoeba and like invertebrates sort of imaginary figure that are sliding vertically and transforming really slowly. Yeah. The soundtrack is really aggressive noise music, and I was very interested at that time by noise music. I was going to a lot of noise concerts, and I was interested by the physicality of it. To me, it felt it was in the right in the same direction that my interest for as a genre film, where the film is supposed to create a sort of physical excitation or physical fear. And so I was really interested in the physical dimension, like visceral dimension of cinema. And also it was in relationship with a text of Freud about the memory and the way the memory function. It's called the magic block, and the idea that memory function by a little bit, I imagine, the same way the cinema function, but he takes the example of the Egyptian first tablet, where
it has also the idea of engraving, scratching. You were scratching off the surface in the movie. Here, the memory, it's kind of like a relief. If we go to the next, the detail, and then to the next, and go to the next 3 slides, haute relief, so this one and the next one, I think your work very early on in these works, you have the gravure, you have the scratching, you have the engraving. Let's go a little bit further. And because this is interesting, because it's nearly like an archaeological research approach. I loved your Egyptomania project when you started doing it. Say a bit about this, because this is archaeology in the 21st century.
Yes, it's true. It's a very good connection. The work with the imprint, our imprint of plastic bag I collected on the site of Saqqara. And it was, I think it's true that it was coming from an interest in the way memory function and the way it's manifest, like culturally for us, as human. And one thing that I was really interested in is the way it manifests also kind of like randomly, like in popular culture. So Egyptomania is a film where I compiled a lot of eBay feature. It was a moment where eBay was really interesting. It's not interesting anymore. But at the time, eBay was really a place where people were photographing their object at home, sometimes with a lot of care and sometimes without care. And I was like, both the way people were photographing object, but also the nature of the object was interesting to me. And a big part of the work was to organize these images into a narration. And I organized it from the most obvious and in a way loyal representation that would be like books and postcards of museum exhibition, to the most derived objects that would be like the soap or the accessory from a Halloween costume.
Yeah.
But also following thematic, and like it was interesting to see that Nefertiti has had a very specific trajectory and a very specific field of meaning associated to her. And Akhenaton had a very different itinerary in popular culture. So that was also interesting to see that each of the figure of ancient Egypt had been appropriated and developed into a story that were becoming very specific and very diverse.
But I like,
so it was a bit like following the thread.
I like how profane you make something so ancient, so sacred, so much the topic of movies and serious scholarship. You go on eBay and you research it on eBay. It's a little bit like what you did with the picture books of the feline animals and the mammals. And if we go through this a bit further, I very much love your encyclopedic approach. So we go further to this slide and have a detail of this work. Augmented objects, what does that mean?
It's it's a bit like Dying Living Woman. You know, a lot of my titles are weird because I'm not native English, and I kind of use the naivete of my approach to English. So augmented object was the idea of an object that has been transformed, like with an addition. The project started as a photographic project. There was a market in the streets where I lived in Belleville in Paris. It's a very popular neighborhood. And in front of the tax office, IRS, there was a lot of people selling whatever they can sell just to survive the day. It wasn't a flea market. it was really a market where people need to survive, so they come and they just present objects. So sometimes there were objects that aren't really sellable, like one shoes, or like the remote control of a device. Nobody knows what it is. But I understood that it was kind of a support system for the community, that it was a way people could help with, you know, like with maintaining a pride and a sort of commercial relationship. Like you knew this person needed help today, so you would buy a shoe or you would buy a remote control.
But
and so
of course, the strategy, you have the relief. So you're scratching something off a film, you are putting a material into the relief to have an imprint of this. See here, you're layering something onto and making it a different kind of object. And this installation views, this work is now in the collection of MoMA, right? So,
yes.
So this is kind of, if you think about it, it's also, of course, about the ready-made. Think about the Marcel Duchamp ending up at MoMA, but here it's about a person who sold something and then you augmented it. So I think this is such an interesting approach, how you make us look differently at these objects. And having the researcher that you are, let's go perhaps 2 slides further and keep it here. This was the work where I really started becoming a huge fan of yours, because I understood the research, the wandering mind of an artist researcher you are. You traveled to Vanuatu for this, right?
Yes. Yes, it was in 2010, and I was nominated for the prize Marcel Duchamp in France, and it was a combination of a personal desire, an opportunity, and a friendship. I had a really good friend who's a writer, and she was born in Vanuatu, and she was constantly talking about it and telling me I should go. But it's very, very far away. And when I was nominated for this prize, I was like, this is going to be the opportunity. I can convince the gallery to give me money so I can film very far away and go there. And I did a little research on the place about what was interesting to me. And there was two different story. One story is the story that of the image we see is the story of the Nagol, which is a ritual that was originally a fertility ritual, where men throw themselves from a high tower made in wood to represent the fertilization of the earth, and they don't hurt themselves because they have wines very elastic attached to their feet.
That's where bungee jumping was. That is where bungee jumping was invented, so to say, right?
Exactly. So it's interesting because what I'm always interested in my work in the misinterpretation and the way culture and culture phenomenon bounce back and circulate. And what was very interesting with this phenomenon is that it's been appropriated by New Zealand tourists, and it became the bungee jumping. But with the ethnocentric habit of the New Zealander, they forgot that it existed there, and then it became an attraction because people were like, oh look, this is like an interpretation of bungee jumping. And so for the people of Vanuatu, it became also a sort of game where they are now staging it for tourists, but a special version that they refabricated. And so there is really this idea of like projection and reconstruction, where the gaze of the outsider is being used to transform the local culture into something else, which is like a performance of the culture itself.
Yeah. How long did you stay in Vanuatu, Camille?
I stayed 2 months.
Oh, that's incredible.
Because it was really far to go, and also I had no idea when the event would happen, because it's very difficult to predict. There's a lot of rains and inundation and flood, and so I had to stay at least 1.5 months on the Penn Coast Island, to make sure I would be there when it happens.
Oh,
and
amazing.
I want to film also something else, which is the $1 Million Point, the place where the American army throw all the equipment in the sea during World War II.
Yeah.
So that's why I stayed such a long time.
Yeah, but the researching and this kind of like, we had this eBay archaeology on, and here you're going to the roots of something like bungee jumping, which is so interesting, and you're having this as a long research day. Let's go a little faster through the next slides, and to the next, we go to the next, and end with this slide here, dormitory. So I just wanted to quickly show these slides because I think what we saw in the relief, what we saw in the first film scratching, there's always a sculptural approach. And I would like to actually go to the next slide and tell us a bit about this very provocative image.
This is an image from Gross Fatigue. It's actually an image, it's something that happened during the shooting where we're filming a frog, and she jumped from the hand of the person who was presenting it into my phone. And then I asked the cameraman to film it because I thought it was really a good image. For me, there was always an association between the digital technology and the reptilian brain, and so the reptilian. And so that was how this image made sense to me.
Yeah, if we go to the next image, when it was Gross Fatigue, the title of this piece, 2013, you showed this in the Venice Biennial, and you got the Silver Lion for this. This was such a groundbreaking piece for everybody who saw it. I remember I couldn't leave the room. And we talked about it amongst colleagues. And I basically said, oh, it's all about the split screen. And then everybody, of course, had a different opinion because it's about everything. It's about the origin of life. Let's go to the next. And your studio was so kind. If we go to the next, talking about space monkeys and split screens. But your studio was so kind to share with us 3 clips. And I do think the Silver Lion for a relatively young artist at the time was so well deserved. And I would like to play 3 clips from this, I consider, real masterpiece. So let's first, and it would be great to have the sound really loud so that everybody can share it. So perhaps at the moment, everybody turns the sound on. Can you hear it, Camille?
No, I cannot hear the sound.
Little talk to virtual MOCA. Can we make sure that the sound is on? See.
In the beginning were quantum fluctuations. In the beginning, the universe was a black egg where heaven and earth were mixed together. In the beginning, there was an explosion. In the beginning, a dark ocean washed on the shores of nothingness and licked the edges of night. In the beginning was the eternal night Han. In the beginning, before all things, there was Amma, and he rested upon nothing. In the beginning, Ta, the demiurge, born from the essential ocean. In the beginning, the fabric of space-time unfurled, it unthreaded. In the beginning, the atoms were formed. In the beginning, a giant cobra floated on the waters. In the beginning, everything was still. There was no beginning. In the beginning and in the void, the oldest of old gods was formed. The world had no time, no shape, and no life, except in the mind of the Creator. In the beginning, the Word already was. There was no world then, only the white, yellow, blue, black, silver, and red mists floating in the air. In the beginning was only the sky above, and water, and marshland below. In the beginning was nucleosynthesis. When the universe became transparent to light, then the Milky Way took form. Then there was no need for light on Zomboling, for the gods emitted a pure light from their own bodies. Then the creator was in the form of a man without bones. Then the gravity of galaxies slowed the expansion of the universe. Then were units of matter. Then Pangu died and parts of his body became parts of the universe. Then there was a recombination, local contraction. Then the supreme god of Ometioto, being both masculine and feminine, spawned 4 children. Then Ra created his wife Hathor, with whom he had a son, Horus, who married Isis. Then Atum took his penis in hand to obtain the pleasure of orgasm thereby. Then Ayuasas was lady of the vulva and hand of God. Then Ogo introduced disorder into the world by committing incest with his mother Earth. Then the first menstrual blood came from this union, as well as Yeban and Andumbulu, the spirits of the underworld. And there was violent relaxation.
I'm so grateful that the sound worked. It's always a special excitement. Will it work or not when you have video? You said you were in Vanuatu for 2 months researching. You have been researching all along as an artistic practice. Research is part of your practice. Here you got a stipend to be a fellow at the Smithsonian Institute. And say a bit about how this whole project started.
When I arrived in New York, I had very few friends, and one of my friends was an artist named Douglas Ross, and he had been invited. I had done the Smithsonian Artist Fellowship, and the Smithsonian always asks our past fellow to recommend an artist to apply. It's kind of a competition with a project, and so he invited me to apply. But he said, be careful, because I know you're very curious, you're gonna want to research everything, but it's really overwhelming, so you need to focus on a specific topic. And of course, this recommendation came a little bit as a sort of like, it made me want more to actually research everything. And I was really also coming from France and looking at the Smithsonian, how it's structured and how also it communicates about itself as an institution. I was really fascinated by the whole encompassing ambition and the mention that, for example, the museum possesses 90% of the fish species we know exist, and also like the dark origin of some of the collection and the guilds and all those issues too, like the way also for natural spaces, the collection of spaces has often drove animal to extinction.
Yeah,
so,
but when I saw this first piece and the ambition, because in the beginning, this poetry, the rhythm, the music, the way how it is cut and edited and collaged together with that, what I said, split screen, it's nothing, it's not humble to do a work on the origin of the universe, but somehow it's also about search machines and how a search machine that we have on our computer today used to be a library or used to be something like like the Smithsonian, like an institute that has basically everything stored. So perhaps we go to the next video. We have 2 clips more from this really incredible piece, and let's all hope the sound will be on.
Mankind discovered the knowledge of history and nature, of minerals, vegetables, animals, and elements, the knowledge of logic and the art of thinking, the sciences of gratification and those of utility, the art of remembering and pure mathematics, the science of physics, the science of medicine, the science of botany, the science of chemistry, the knowledge of politics, the knowledge of alphabets, the knowledge of magic and the science of God, the knowledge of virtue and the mechanics of poetry, the science of laws and the science of commerce, metaphysics of bodies and the transcendental geometry, the dynamics, the hydraulics, the optics, the dioptrics, the acoustics and grammar, music, cosmology, geography, orthography, chronology, zoology, physiology, pathology, astrology, areology, and more.
It's nothing short of explaining all or nothing, Camille. This is such an incredibly important work. What brought you to this formal, this finding this form of the split screen? What found you? What made you? What was the composing basically strategy, or is it something that happens through the research?
It's something that happens through the research, and it's also kind of connected with the way I lived at that time. I was very interested in researching the origin of the computer when I was at the Smithsonian, and it was one of the curators that actually was also the most interested in my research, which sometimes was surprising a little bit to some people, because it's the opposite of what they do. They are hyper specialized, and I was kind of like doing a research basically on everything. But she was very interested in helping me, and I remember it was very interesting for me to look at the project of Vannevar Bush and the origin of the computer being some kind of like sort of like desk, and also the idea that the book is the model of the computer. The MacBook still, have the word book in it. And so I was really interested in like using the desktop of the computer, because the desktop of the computer is where knowledge is being stored nowadays. And this is also the way information appears to us most of the time. And I was also very inspired by a book of Jean-Luc Nancy about globalization and the idea that excess is the way the universe is appearing to us right now. And it comes to us unsorted or sorted by logic that isn't academic or even, I would say, coming from an university background. It's a logic of algorithm that is also driven by commercial logic. So it appears to us random, and so the whole thing that was really interesting is also to see how the Smithsonian himself was using technology to present its own collection. So
the Smithsonian digitized now? Is the Smithsonian, are all the different samples, all the different animals that are in shelves, is everything digitized and scanned?
No, I don't think everything is digitalized. I think everything is inventoried, like there is a number, but and they have picture for every specimen when they studied. I remember I spent a lot of time with the bird section, for example, and they have it's really beautiful because the way they study it, they have to identify on a palette the exact color of each bird, the exact green and the exact yellow and the exact brown. And so that's also, a lot of the film is inspired by the technique of research of the curator that I observed. So that, for example, the palette of color was also coming from that, but it's also a reference to Goethe and the idea of the sphere of color being an image of the universe as well.
I can only tell you that you inspired a whole generation of curators to think about exhibitions about split screen, because the layering, collaging, you have multiple windows open, you put a window on top of a window where the sound is bleeding. And I think that was one of the really great inspirations from this piece. So perhaps we see the last clip of this and then go forward with the chronology. Hope the sound works.
But the universe continues to expand and distend indifferently. And Amtada settled down with the cat for company and grew bored with his routine and Humans evolved from the same clade as lemurs, rabbits, and rodents. He decided to create beings like himself to keep him company. In the beginning, there was no one to praise God's glory. The sun bearer hauled the sun across the sky on his back. The woman who fell from the sky rested on the turtle's back. God blessed the seventh day and sanctified it, because that in it he had rested from all his work. The arrow of time points to the heat depth of the universe. The whole earth was heavy, and then Yahweh rested. Relaxation is the settling of a system into equilibrium. Resting. Pangu laid down, and resting, he died. The arrow of time, the depth of the universe, Pangu lay down, and resting, he died. Yeah.
There's a word in orange on the universal screensaver. Let's go to the next 3 slides, because I think when an artist has such an outstanding success with a piece like you had with Grosse Fatigue, it's always the danger that the artist then is always identified with this work and has to show it over and over and over again. You and I showed this piece as well, I remember. But if we go 1 slide further, and let's have a look at this, because what you basically did is and that is of course a wrong description, and correct me with your understanding as an artist, but I felt when you did Pale Fox, which was a year later, and it was Chisenhale and Münster, and it traveled internationally, this was like as if you were building Grosse Fatigue in space, and you have here the images, you made your whole mental research space accessible in terms of objects and collages. And we go back 1 more and 1 more. You could literally walk into your research process. Say a bit about Pale Fox, please. How that liberated you, or was it more like completing a certain process?
Yeah, actually, it was a really good interpretation of it. It was quite liberating, because Grosse Fatigue was a very painful process, to be honest, because the amount of research was too big to actually be conducted in a sort of like rational way, and there was a lot of unfinished paths and direction that I didn't use in the film, and I felt like it hurt me to leave them behind. And when I was invited to do the Pale Fox at Chisenhale, it was very shortly after Grosse Fatigue. The exhibition was planned actually before Venice Biennale selection. So it was kind of very much at the same time that I started to work on the show. And I integrated a lot of the research and the thinking. And most notably, I integrated a sort of schema that I had made while doing Grosse Fatigue to organize the images. I made some kind of schema about, where things belong and how to structure the film. And I used this schema to make the installation of Pale Fox. And it became a little bit also about the madness of principle, when there is too much principle. And then this excess of principle, in the end, is an occasion to illustrate how disorder is a principle that is integrated into order. So it becomes about this dynamic between order and disorder, and about how different principles can conflict or meet or join. So I organize the space with like the 4 principles of Leibniz, and the idea of the 4 ages of man: childhood, teenagehood, adulthood, and old age, and also the elements. And also it's kind of like a reflection on the civilization and there is digital age, and there is like a sort of economical age, which is like the 19th, 20th century industrial age, and there is agricultural age. And so there is a sort of like meditation on the different phases of human civilization, but it's mostly also about my personal story. I integrated images from my own childhood, and also all the objects I had collected on eBay, because I was a very compulsive eBay buyer. And I accumulated like 10,000 of objects that I carried from Paris to New York. And when I unwrapped the object in New York, I realized how crazy it was. And maybe that's also why my object got blocked, because there was a lot of weird objects in the package. And so I
love this kind of a liberation in a literal sense.
Yes, and I needed to find a way for those objects to exist as an artwork and to get rid of them. They wouldn't fit in my studio. I had transported them all the way from France to New York, but I didn't realize in New York I was only able to afford a really small studio, so they wouldn't fit. So then what I did after I finished the Gross Fatigue is I unpacked everything, and then I reorganized everything into category. And then I shipped everything back to Europe, and it became
a fantastic show. It was a fantastic show and another breakthrough success just a year after Gross Fatigue. Our studio visits, Camille, normally have the format of an hour, and you're so eloquent and it's so incredibly generous how much you share about the work. So we go a little bit faster through the next 100 slides, basically. So we go with a relative fast pace to see the variety of work you're doing. Go to the next. Unanswered emails. I remember when let's go in a fast pace through the emails. So this through the photos. I remember when you did this in Berlin at the Berlin Biennial, and now we are getting, let's go a little faster with the slides so that we have a view of these works. This was Palais de Tokyo, the unanswered email. So we go to a detail here, we go further. We go further. This is perhaps we go to the next slide, because this is exactly the moment. I remember I called you there once and I said, Camille, what are you doing? And she said, you were basically saying, I'm researching what it means to do a fresco. And I remember we were on WhatsApp or on the phone, and you explained to me that you are applying color onto a still wet wall. And in this picture, you see actually through a doorway at a wall where there is painting on, the fresco on, and then there is another doorway next to it. So this is really a huge architectural work, basically. Let's go a little further. This is Palais de Tokyo, where you had the carte blanche. Let's go and see we can go further with this. Just to show the variety of works and sculptures and approaches you had here. Let's go for the next. Let's go a little further. Let's go a bit further. And the next. And perhaps you'd say a little bit about this one here, because the others, we could see sculptures and drawings, which perhaps are also like an experience. You see them in the museum. But what is this, Camille?
This is a new film I did in 2017. It's called Tuesday. It was part of Palais de Tokyo, which was structured by the day of the week. The whole exhibition was a meditation on the way dependency is structuring our time. And Tuesday is a film about the addiction to adrenaline and like competition and the aggressive impulse. And so it was interwoven two type of footage. One is a jiu-jitsu fighter in their training that they do every week, and the training of racing horses. And the film is filmed in really, really slow motion with a very sort of sensual and contemplative music. I was very much inspired by the idea of Deleuze, of, you know, what the masochist vision of violence is, which is like the way art history is actually built, which is like freezing the movement,
Yeah.
and offering it to contemplation.
But in a work like this, you're not shying away from a certain modernist approach or an homage to modernism. You're not shying away from something that is both devotion and violence. And you're also not shying away from being very explicit. And perhaps if we go forward, this is basically, just to rest on this image quickly, this is a piece that we are very, very grateful is coming to MOCA. It's now in the MOCA collection here in Los Angeles. Such a great piece. So let's go a little further, and we go further, and you talked about violence, aggression. Let's go a bit further. Let's talk about this, because this feels more about fragility and vulnerability, Camille. Do you want to say about a bit about this? I also think when you did this work, you were highly pregnant.
I was pregnant when the work was presented at Palais De Tokyo, but when I filmed it, I wasn't. It's a film called Saturday, and it's actually even more research than Grosse Fatigue. It's a film I started to work on right after Grosse Fatigue, but it took me kind of like 5 years of work to be able to film it. It's a sort of like investigation into the Seventh-day Adventists, but using the Seventh-day Adventists more as a sort of medium to kind of address the way hope in human strategy is taking the different shapes that hopes can take. So there is the science, and there is medical intervention, and there is the religion and protest activism. And it was a moment Trump got elected in the US, and the news were very catastrophic, and like many people, I was trying to find like hope and to like have a sort of like positive vision of the future, but also I was feeling constantly aggressed by the news themselves. So it also became about the way the relationship with truth, and the way like who's speaking when we read the news, and how much it affects our life.
Yeah. An image like this, which is part of Saturday, do you want to say a bit about this one? I think this is such a striking image.
Yeah, this is a film in a lab that is doing very forward, very like in advanced research on the development of the brain. And they are researching how the human brain reacts to different images. So, but I made the slideshow, so it's kind of like it became really funny, because I wanted to film the experience, but I wanted to propose my own images for the slideshow. So because I wanted to talk about empathy, and so it was interesting for me that there is these images of crying babies, and the idea that they would experiment on, you know, human brain reaction to those images.
Yeah, I remember you when you were at the Palais de Tokyo talking about these. So if we go a little bit further, so no, let's go one back. So this is a colonoscopy. This is where you have a camera enter your body. Let's go for the next. And then I added here, perhaps the next. I added to these collages. We go to the next. And let's have a look at these. They are like 10 watercolors. Let's see the next. They're very, very tender, beautiful works. Let's go to the next. And just perhaps have this pace to go through them. Perhaps we stay here. This is a work from right now, Camille, right?
Yes.
Do you want to say a bit about what inspires you in a work like this?
It's I finished it just before having to leave the studio. It was in March. it's actually a painting. It's the first successful painting. I was trying to have the same freedom in painting that I have with drawing. So that's what can I say about the image itself? It's always difficult to talk about drawings or painting because they are so instinctive, at the opposite of the film in a way, in sort of very opposite scope. But this series is called System of Attachment, and it's exploring feeling around attachment and how it's kind of a structural element for a child, but also for us as adults. And another direction inside the system of attachment work, there is one section of it that is more focused on the idea of food, being food to another human. So the idea of breastfeeding and how this experience is actually shaping the gender prejudice and gender construction.
We have sculptures to this point, what you're just saying, Camille. So we can show the first sculpture, perhaps a second as well, and the third. And then let's go to the last two watercolors. First this, and then the second, and then perhaps we go back. Let's go one back. These are the two last slides that you were so kind to share with us. Not clean yet, from 2020. We're talking about the feeding and the putting in the world. Would you mind saying a bit about those last two works? Because I think they are such strong images.
These images in particular, Not Clean Yet, is kind of a series I made for the magazine The Plant. I was asked to make drawings about the environment, and it was actually something I was already sort of working in. So it's always nice, when somebody invites you to do something you actually were starting just to work on. And it was very tempting to use the idea of potty training. Like, I was reading about it in the US website, which, like, the whole language seems really foreign and weird and curious to me. So I was inspired by the way American, WikiHow talk about it. And then I also realized that the way we have to learn about how to behave as human on Earth right now is very similar to a sort of like children education. Like, we are kind of children to this situation, situation of ecological catastrophe. We shouldn't be children to it, because it was already happening when our parents were young adults and we were kids. But I feel like, as I'm in between the generation of my parents, which are the boomers, which didn't feel a great responsibility, and in between also the generation that comes after me, who has a great sense of responsibility and who's going to be very directly impacted by the situation. And so I felt like it was very natural for me to use the metaphor of the generation to address the situation.
Yeah. And this one, of course, I looked at this, and I think in this very unprecedented times, we all feel so aware of our body. We hear something about blood clots on the news. We hear something about respiratory droplets and how the whole, we are, I think, more aware of all bodily functions and vulnerabilities than normal. But of course, I don't want to overinterpret this. If you would describe this piece, how would you describe it?
I just felt like when the coronavirus crisis began, there was this very anxious first week where I think we all were extremely worried that we were sick or somebody who we love is becoming sick. So it almost felt like that we were scanning ourselves constantly. Is my heartbeat accelerating? Do I have fever? I feel hot. Does my child has fever? Like, what would happen if we're both sick? And then this whole kind of like very heavy awareness of the fragility and the complexity of our bodies, reading description of the impact of the virus and how different it impacts different category of population. And so it came a little bit naturally to me that this situation where the character, they play the ball, they run, they do laundry, they do gym, but at the same time, you can see the veins and the heart and the brain. I've always been inspired anyway by the idea of what's happening inside the body. We saw the image of the coloscopy. I think it's a really good that you added this image of the film Saturday, because in a way this image is it's a very good illustration of how I developed the work after the drawings, especially, and how I kind of draw inspiration from also the experience of the echography.
Yeah.
And what the skin represent to us, the skin being the last limit to protect our intimacy, but also this is like now disappearing because we both, like, we're all going to be scanned constantly, and the temperature of our body is going to become an image, and everything that is happening inside our body is probably going to be not a private thing anymore.
Yeah, I was so intrigued to see today in the studio visit the very early children's activities when you were 7. Basically, you were cutting out of encyclopedia and out of magazines you could find, and you put all the felines, the cats together, you put all the birds together. You couldn't nearly write. You say like small birds, was like trying to write it. And thinking about you creating an encyclopedia, you looking at different ways of how to research and systematize, how to create an encyclopedia, and how to layer and group and compare all these different researches that you are doing. Of course, also we saw the orange that then all of a sudden became the earth in the universe in gross fatigue. There's all a very much an ecological understanding in your work. It's ecological in terms of that all things are connected. You have the little turtles go out on the beach there in gross fatigue. You have here the breathing and the blood system. You have always in your work, even the wrestlers, the sculpture that comes to MOCA, always this tension between the inside and the outside of the world. You being a young mother, you being such this insightful artist that works with sciences and research, how do you think will art and daily life be influenced going forward with this crisis? What do you think will be the impact both on the arts and on daily life?
I mean, I hope that the experience of daily life can finally become a topic that doesn't have a gender prejudice attached. I think especially like family life in a way, and also domestic activities. I hope that there is this kind of ancient category where the politique and the society is totally disconnected from the intimate, and the subjective is something that is going to be destroyed, or at least like have a crack. And so that's one of the hope I have. Then it's hard to say also, you know, how it's going to impact our daily life. I feel like I keep thinking about that, and I wonder if people will want to party more because they haven't been able to party for such a long time, or will they kind of like get used? It's difficult to say how much it will impact. I feel like, I mean, we're all kind of discovering different things, because I also feel like we are living very, very different experiences. I feel like this crisis is showing that if you have money and if you don't, if you have a family and if you don't, if you have a home on your own or if you're renting, you are in a very, very different situation. If you have your job or you don't have your job anymore, if you have started to work or you're still like going out of school and up in the market. I think there's also a lot of inequalities that are going to be increased. And so it's difficult to make a sort of general statement about, you know, how we as a collectivity, because I feel like we is going to be shattered into extremely different situation. And what I hope from a more sort of general vision is that there is enough empathy and awareness, despite the fact that we all have our different struggle, to kind of be able to still be a community with a common culture, and the ability to speak to each other.
Oh, that's such a beautiful statement, Camille. Thank you so much. Thank you for the studio visit.